Sorry.
All good, you ready?
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you. Because we want people to come in. Welcome everybody to the monthly Centennial Speaker Series of the San Marino Historical Society. My name is John Morris and I'm honored to serve as the President of the Historical Society, particularly this year. Marino Elliott is one of my board members here. She's the corresponding secretary. She's the only board member other than Nick, who's our program chair. But they're here and I appreciate everyone else being here. This series has been tremendously successful this year. And I heard from another board member today, you mean you're continuing it after the summer? And I said, yeah, it's still the centennial year. So Nick and I will be getting together next week to start planning September, October, November. We already have, I'll tell you, after this meeting, what April, May, and June will be bringing for you. We have great ones. Tonight we have the person that probably spent more hours doing research on putting together the Centennial book than any other member of the book committee, Nick Curry. Nick is a 1961 graduate of San Marino High School, has a passion for history as a vocation and as an avocation. So I can't think of anyone better to know more of the stories of some of the people about San Marino issues and environs. And so he's the best person to share with you the Guggenheims and their role in the foundation of aeronautics, astronautics, and rocketry at Caltech, JPL, etc. Nick?
Thank you, John. Thank you. I'd like to begin this with a short introduction. We're going to talk about the Guggenheim family. They're the ones that really made all this possible, combined with Dr. Robert Goddard, and Charles Lindbergh served as an impetus in this story. And prior to getting into all the details of this and the scenario of events that took place, I'd like to introduce Doug Bruchet here, who has pictures, about, 12 or 15 of them, that'll kick this thing off. And then, because it's not in sync with what I'm going to say, so we figured that'd be the best way to handle this thing. So Doug, if you can start the pictures. This is the granddad, Meyer Guggenheim, who was the immigrant, 1847-48, from the ghettos of Switzerland, came to Philadelphia with his family. There are the seven. Meyer's in the middle with the seven famous Guggenheim brothers. That's a 1901 picture in New York. And we'll talk about those seven brothers.
There are 8.
Well, there's dad and 7 brothers. Yeah. Where was that? That's up in Leadville, Colorado. That's where really the fortune, as we know it, really got started in the mining industry at 10,000 feet. 1881, we'll talk about that in detail. Harry Frank Guggenheim, who was a flyboy. He was a naval flyer in World War I in France. He came home. Dad, I don't want to be in the mining or the smeltering business. I want to be in the aviation business. That's the thing of the future. This is 1919. And that's Harry Frank. We'll talk about him a lot. Daniel Guggenheim, his father, who supplied the wherewithal, the fortune, to enable Harry to pursue his dreams with few qualifiers at all. That's the, is that the Hempstead? That's the Hempstead Mansion at Sands Point out on Long Island, on the Long Island Sound. It's a compound of 3 mansions. Daniel, the father, had a mansion. His son, Harry, had a mansion. And then there was Castle Gould, left by Harold Gould, who was the son of Jay Gould, the Erie Railroad green mailer from the 19th century days. Oh, Harry and
2 daughters.
2 daughters. Yep.
1942 or something.
Yeah, World War II, early. At Caltech, the Daniel Guggenheim Graduate School of Aeronautics, May of 1929. That really was the formal kickoff of JPL. Still there today.
Full self.
Yep. Oh, let's see. Frank Lloyd Wright. That's Solomon Guggenheim and his wife and Frank Lloyd Wright. That's the model for the Guggenheim Museum, Solomon Guggenheim Museum on Fifth Avenue, New York, next to the Frick, across the street from the Met.
Peggy.
Oh, Peggy Guggenheim, one of the cousins who has a fabulous museum in Venice. More about that. And,
Playboy.
well, that's Daniel.
Is it?
Yeah, Daniel Guggenheim, just prior to his death in 1930. Yeah. Harry was a young man.
That's George Denver.
Was that George Denver? Oh, he committed suicide in 39. But what came out of it were the famous Guggenheim grants with no strings attached, we're going to talk about, because of his suicide. There we have it,
This is Colorado.
up in Colorado.
Bought a house, seat.
Oh, yeah, Simon Guggenheim was a U.S. Senator from Colorado, 1907 through 1913.
That's about it.
And that's it, okay, well, that'll whet the appetite. We are in the baronial living room of Harry Guggenheim at Sands Point on Long Island Sound in New York. This is 1927, it's a few weeks after Lindbergh made his famous flight in May of 27 across the Atlantic successfully. He was back, and he said, you know, Harry Guggenheim called this dinner between Lindbergh and Dr. Robert Goddard. And Lindbergh was the one who initiated all this because the two of them were friends. Harry Guggenheim and Lindbergh were friends. They were, obviously, because of their interests, mutual in aviation. So the dinner was arranged and it went forth. And there we go. Okay. So the upshot was, here we are at this dinner, and Guggenheim is introduced to Dr. Robert Goddard, he was the first U.S. rocket scientist. His first success was up in Auburn, Mass, out of Clark University, March 16, 1926, where a rocket took off in a highly populated area, if you can believe in that. This was a problem. And anyway, so they all met, they all had dinner, and they talked everything over, and this really was the true precursor to what JPL is all about. I know that's a real stretch, but this is serious business, because Harry Guggenheim had the money and the will and the desire and all the other resources to put behind the financing of his vision and dreams. And one thing led to another. Goddard was impressed with Guggenheim, obviously, and Guggenheim was highly impressed with Dr. Robert Goddard, even though he had this great reputation that kind of was a kook at Clark University, from which he was a teacher, a professor there from, in the 1890s up until his death in 45. He was always on staff in one capacity or another. Harry Guggenheim said, you know, we need to move this out from Auburn, Mass. We need to move this thing out to Roswell, New Mexico. And it's safer for all this experimentation and so on. So in 1929, the move was made, and Goddard was in tall cotton, as they say. He was successful in all this elaborate experimentation. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then the upshot, when we get to JPL, really is May of 1929 on the Caltech campus with the inauguration. You saw the picture of the Daniel Guggenheim Aeronautical Engineering Building. Daniel Guggenheim was there. He died a year later in 1930 at 74. Harry was there, Goddard was there, Lindbergh was there, and Robert Millikan, of course, at Caltech, was there, along with another selection of entourage, obviously. And that's when Daniel Guggenheim wrote the big check to make all this possible, for really realizing the dreams and the vision of his son, Harry. And that's truly the formal beginning of JPL. Goddard began to run this thing in 29, and he said, look, I'm not an administrator, I'm not a politician, I don't want to do this. I'm an experimenter, I'm a scientist. I'll be a caretaker until we find somebody who's qualified to run this outfit. go out and find somebody. Well, they did in 1930. Theodore von Karman, the great physicist, applied mathematician. Von Karman came in 1930 and he gave it up in 1949 and did wonders, believe me. JPL was truly formalized in 1944 during World War II. Harry Guggenheim took this to the Army, the Navy, anybody who would listen, especially during World War II, even before World War II, about this concept of American rocketry. And they were always poo-pooed and said, well, that guy's nuts, he has a reputation for being crazy and all that sort of stuff. But Harry Guggenheim continued to persist. He knew he was onto something. And well, the rest is history. Beginning in '44, there was finally acceptance by the Army. And JPL was truly formalized by then. And the rest is history on that score. So anyway, let's back up a little bit and talk about the Guggenheim family. They came over here in 1847, 48 to Philadelphia. Simon was the guy who sired Meyer, and Meyer was the father of these 7 boys, the famous Guggenheim brothers. And they were in Philadelphia for quite some time. They came out of a Swiss ghetto. They were peddlers, Jewish peddlers. And that's what they did in Philadelphia. And then they got into the business of stove polish. And they made a fortune, if you can believe that, selling stove polish in the 1850s. And then they got into the business, well, we can do better than that, let's manufacture the stove polish. So they got into that. And then they got into the business of home decorating, which was lace and embroidery. This was before paint and wallpaper. And they made a fortune doing that. And all 7 brothers, and there was all intermarriages. They all married their first cousins, this kind of thing to keep the money in the family. That's very common in that way of life, believe me. Finally, in 1881, Meyer was really set very well financially. The 7 boys were coming along very well, doing well. And some friend of Meyer said, you know, out there in Leadville, Colorado, there's a tremendous mining operation, plural, going on out there. You should go out there and take a look at it. Well, Meyer was hesitant and all that. He didn't quite believe everything, but he finally was persuaded by his boys to take a look at this thing. And he bought 2 mines, sight unseen, in Leadville, which is 10,000 feet. And they were closed up to be non-productive. And Meyer finally, a year later in 1882, went out there to Leadville and was convinced that he really had something, that he made a good buy, that these mines could be made to be producers. And he hired a lot of people, and sure enough, those mines paid off in short order, which truly, they were on their way to, as we say, major money. 1883, 84, 85, and there was a lot of competition there too, I might add. Then we get to the point where the Standard Oil gang came in. The Standard Oil gang, well, who was that? That was William Rockefeller, who was 2 years younger than John D. Sr. John D. Sr. was a businessman. He was not a guy who wanted to speculate. And his brother, William, was a great speculator. And so there was always a rub between the 2 brothers on that score. Well, you're speculating, you know, I'm not interested. That was John D.'s response. So William made a deal with Henry Rogers and James Stillman, the guy who founded Citibank, as we know it today, in New York. And that formed the Standard Oil gang. Those 3, Henry Rogers, Stillman, and William Rockefeller. And what they did was they created the precursorship to the American Smelting and Refining Company. They went around in the 1890s and they gathered up all the major smelters in this country, of which there were 19 of them. And they wanted to get the Guggenheims to participate because they too were in the smeltering business in a minor way as a result of their success at Leadville. The money is in smeltering, it's not in mining. And the Guggenheims knew that right off the bat. And they resisted. And this is 1899. 1900, then 1901 came along, and finally Henry Rogers, and I'll talk about him just in a minute, Henry Rogers gave up the ghost because he had more important business with the old Standard Oil Trust. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So he gave up the ghost, he went to the Guggenheims and said, let's make a deal. And the Guggenheims ended up in 1901 taking over the entire precursorship to the American Smelting and Refining Company, ASARCO, which is still going today, which was renamed after the Guggenheims took over in 1901. There was a first among equals among these 7 brothers. It was Daniel, who was the second son, the second born. There were no females. They all came later, these 7 boys. Boom, 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 just like that. And although they were 15 years apart from the oldest to the youngest, but anyway. So as a result, Daniel was the one who was so man before his time. He wanted to give up the ghost really in 1915, but the powers that be said, you know, you can't do this. You're the only one who knows really what's going on from an overall standpoint. So he agreed to stay on until 1919 upon the Versailles Peace Treaty, and then he passed the baton. The upshot was that his boy, Harry Frank Guggenheim, was a naval flyer in France. He was groomed, he was born in 1890. He was groomed by his father and others to come into the business because he too was well endowed with financial and business acumen. And he was encouraged to follow his father. But he came home in 1919 and said, "Dad, I want to pursue aviation. I have this vision, I have this dream," plural. And that's the direction the world's going in. And we need wherewithal, we had money, we need resources to back this and pursue that and to develop it and all that kind of stuff. And he was very successful in convincing his father to finance his dreams, which he did, from 1919 up until his death in 1930. Well, of course, that's reflected up here on the screen here in May of '29, that's when the bricks and mortar went into place, when the first aeronautical engineering building on the West Coast was established at Caltech. So, as I say, that truly was the beginning of JPL. Daniel died in 30. He had a couple of brothers, which are interesting. We'll go to Simon Guggenheim. He had one son, died at 17 years old in some freak accident. The other son was 28. He committed suicide in 39. George, they never knew why. And as a result, Simon Jr., really the second, decided, he was a brother to Daniel, younger brother, he decided we're going to create the Simon Guggenheim Scholarship Grants. No strings attached for applicants who are qualified in the academic world. And that's exactly what he did. Those Guggenheim grants are going to this day. And they're very generous. They're on a par with the MacArthur Foundation, if you're familiar with John T. and Catherine MacArthur. They give out the same thing. Absolutely no strings attached. They have spies out there. I knew one at the Huntington Library. That's how I know this. He was a spy. And he would be mindful of a person who was endeavoring, this is the case of the MacArthur Foundation, he would be mindful of somebody who really had talent and art and commitment and dedication and everything else for success in whatever his field was, writing, film, ceramics, carpentry, you name it, whatever it was. And then my colleague would take it back to Chicago and they'd kick this around in the board meeting and they would select, I think, what do they select? Roughly 20, I think, 20 a year, maybe 25 a year. And they're given $500,000 right off the bat, no strings attached. Well, that $500,000 is done over a 5-year period. That's the way it works. No strings at all. Well, they took a page, I met him one time, that was a treat. MacArthur took a page out of Simon Guggenheim's program that he started in the late 30s and who does the same thing today. So it's kind of interesting the way things work in that regard. Well, that's Simon Guggenheim's great contribution. Incidentally, I should back up a little bit too. The Guggenheims went all over the world, the Western world, for mining. They were throughout Central America, Mexico, South America, Alaska, throughout the United States, Western Europe, South Africa. They used the great efforts of John Hayes Hammond, the great mining engineer, who died in 1936, who was absolutely one of the greatest mining engineers that ever lived, along with Samuel Untermeyer, who was the great mining attorney at that time. So they had great people working for them, and with all these mining and smeltering interests, you can see where this fortune just continued to grow and grow and grow for the benefit of all 7 brothers. Another brother is Murray. Murray was third in line, and he was a New Yorker, and he was kind of the money guy that always was going to Wall Street raising money to finance their latest acquisition, their latest endeavor of one kind or another. And he created a program, his wife was the one who did it, recognized the fact that these kids in New York all had dental problems. And so they created this dental fund. It was 1935 when they did that. And There was free dental work given to all the kids in all the New York schools, all 5 boroughs, from 1935 up until 1967. And it was from K through grade 12, all free. Finally, I think it was Robert Wagner, who was a mayor of New York at that time, finally took the thing over. And now Bloomberg is now not so 16-ounce sodas. Bloomberg is in charge of it now, so yeah. So that's Murray's contribution. The other interesting brother is Benjamin Guggenheim. He was always kind of a maverick, and he was the youngest one of the 7 brothers, and his work ethic could have been better than it was. Anyway, he went down with the Titanic. Yeah. And he left a daughter by the name of Peggy Guggenheim, who shared in all this great wealth. More about her in a few minutes. But Daniel was the first among equals. He was the guy carrying the flag. He was the guy that really ran that fortune up to immense numbers. Let's go to Solomon Guggenheim. That's the other brother. He was a great art collector, fine arts, mainly fine arts. And then, of course, he got a little bit of modern art as well. That's a whole other dimension, as we probably all know. And he conceived this in 1937, that he was going to build a museum in New York on Fifth Avenue to house this wonderful collection that he had accumulated over all these years. These Guggenheim brothers were born in the 1856, 58, 60, 62, 64, 66, 68, 72, just to give you an idea of the time span. And anyway, Solomon was born in 58, as I remember. And so he decided he was going to build this museum in 37. Well, he hired Frank Lloyd Wright and Aruba Rumey was her name, who was a curator with a great reputation. And I don't know how he ever got in there, but the great Robert Moses was all part of this team. You know who Robert Moses was? Robert Moses was the guy coming off of World War I who developed the entire infrastructure of the tri-state area, Connecticut, New York, the 5 boroughs, Long Island, and New Jersey. Highways, bridges, and tunnels. Moses was an extremely controversial character. What he did was he created all this. Bridges, tunnels, highways, freeways, they call them throughways back there. And he used eminent domain, and he powered all this through like a dictator. And he was very successful. Well, this was back in 1919, up through the 20s, the 30s. Even World War II didn't stop him. And he was very powerful. And where did he get his power? And he was interested in art, with Solomon Guggenheim. Where he got his power was he had control of every fare box in the tri-state area. You know, you go a quarter of a mile in New York, tri-state area, you pay. You pay big time back there, even today. And he had control of all that money. Fare boxes at tunnels, bridges, and throughways. And he had control of this thing. And so many mayors in New York tried to get rid of him. Governors in New York tried to get rid of him. FDR tried to get rid of him from 1932 to 45 without success because it was uncontrolled. There was no oversight over this guy, none, over all this power. Finally, Nelson Rockefeller, as governor in 1958, 59, 60, nailed him and said, "Bob, it's time to retire. We need an oversight committee here on this." And Nelson Rockefeller, as governor, was successful in convincing Moses that he should retire and all that, which he did, and that was the end of it. But Moses was a big player in the Solomon Guggenheim Museum, and which is located up on Fifth. I'm sure a lot of you have probably been there. It's a circular deal, you can't miss it. Frank Lloyd Wright, that was his dream, that was his vision. Solomon Guggenheim was totally against it. He said, "How do you hang pictures on curved walls?" And Hilaire Roubaix was the other one, the great curator from Hungary, said the same thing. How do you hang pictures from curvatures and that sort of thing? But they duked it out and they finally agreed to it. The sad part was that Solomon Guggenheim died in 1949. He saw the model, which you saw there. He never saw the finished product, which opened in October of 1959. There was so much strife, so much controversy about building this museum. Hilaire Roubaix really was the only one to survive all that. The grand opening in October of 59. Frank Lloyd Wright died in Arizona up at Taliesin West in Phoenix in April of 59. So at 89 years old, he never saw it, the finished product. And Hill Roubaix was the real winner on the deal. And of course, the rest is history. The Solomon Guggenheim Museum today is a fabulous thing, right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I like to call it the J.P. Morgan Museum. That's the way it should be known as. From 1870 to 1913, that guy was the sole financier behind that thing and the great success of that thing. And then the Frick is up there too. Henry Clay Frick is right there across the street. That's another fabulous story. That's a Rockefeller story, or rather a Carnegie story, and then it gets to a Rockefeller story. So anyway, the upshot is those are the main brothers that really shared. The remaining brothers, unnamed, they did their own philanthropic thing on a much lesser scale, and good for them. Today, the foundation has about $80 million in it, and it goes out for charitable causes, mainly Hebrew-Jewish causes, in the name of education, culture, particularly with emphasis on antiquity as it relates to Jewish culture, that kind of thing, in the greater New York area. And they've expanded the Guggenheim Museum also. They have other branches and satellites and that kind of thing as well. I want to go back to, just for a minute, on the Standard Oil gang too. That's important. Henry Rogers and James Stillman, the banker, Citibank, and then William Rockefeller, the great speculator. The great story there is that they would have had this thing. They had 19 smelters all lined up. It was a monopoly, just like the Standard Oil Trust was a monopoly. And there's no reason why the smeltering industry in those days, we're talking 1899, things changed after that, couldn't be a monopoly, which it was. But it was poorly managed and they had a lot of problems there. But what's interesting is Henry Rogers his name is Henry Huddleston Hellhound Rogers. Started off in 1840 in the oil fields, well, in the 1850s and 60s, in the oil fields of Titusville, PA. And he ended up on 26th Broadway with Rockefeller Sr., ended up in Cleveland first in 1880, 1881, 82, and then they finally moved up to New York because Rockefeller knew that was the headquarters for the oil industry, was New York City, was not Cleveland, Ohio, and so they made the move in 1882 at 26th Broadway. And Rogers he was an SOB. He had a real tough reputation for getting things done. I don't want excuses, I just want results, that kind of thing. And he was very adept at getting those results. The good news about Henry Rogers was in building the Standard Oil Trust, which he truly did with Henry Flagler and John Archbold and John D. Sr. All of them had a hand in this thing. But Rogers really carried the flag on that part of the deal. And that was that Rogers then, he died at 69 in 1909, before the famous breakup in 1911, May of 1911, when the famous breakup of Standard Oil took place. And he always said, beginning around 1900, 1901, we're all going to go to jail on this thing, and Rockefeller's going to go with us. Well, he never lived to see the breakup. And the end of that story is that when the breakup did occur, it was effective May of 15th of 1911, and they had to have it completed in December 15th of 1911, 6 months later. What happened was 34 different companies were formed, and Rockefeller got 34 more times richer as a result. And so did the estate of Henry Rogers. Henry Rogers, upon his untimely demise, but 69 and 1909 was old. Not today, but it was old then. And he gave back 100, this was before taxes. There were no taxes then, Civil War, that kind of thing, but that was it. 1909, he gave back $150 million to his hometown, Fairhaven, Mass., which is it's a big whaling port. His home was there, it's since been torn down. Nobody could afford to maintain this place. He gave him the school, he gave him the library, he gave him the hospital, he gave him a tack factory, which employed thousands of people to manufacture thumbtacks, that kind of thing. The guy was so generous in that regard. The other great thing about Henry Rogers was that he had a doctor in New York City, and the doctor also treated Mark Twain. And this is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. This is 1894. And the doctor brokered the deal between Mark Twain and Henry Rogers to put them together, because Mark Twain was broke in 1894. He had financed this linotype the equivalent to a linotype. The linotype 1 for setting type and producing newspapers, and whatever the name of, I should know that name, but I've forgotten it. It's unpronounceable, multi-syllabled. There's one left at the Mark Twain Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. He's got it. It's up there in the house. It's absolutely beautiful. You get to Hartford, go to the Mark Twain Shrine, Home, and Museum. It's all there. But he went broke in '94 financing all this, and so he was really down and out. So Henry Rogers agreed to help Mark Twain restore all his finances. Well, they became great buddies, and they were both great yachtsmen and sailors, and Henry Rogers had a great yacht, 325 feet long. They loved to go up and down the New York, Long Island Sound, out to Bermuda, that kind of thing, the Bahamas and so on, down to Florida with Flagler, another story, and which they did. They became great friends and all the humor and all that kind of stuff, and so the upshot was that Mark Twain's finances were all restored by Rogers. The other great thing about Henry Rogers was that somebody got to him, I forget who. There's this woman by the name of Helen Keller.
Oh, boy.
She's blind, she's deaf. Well, guess who made the endowment for life? And for Anne Sullivan also, Henry Rogers. So that enabled them financially to go the complete distance on that score. So this is all collateral information of the Guggenheims, but it's important to the whole overall story. So we have better appreciation and perspective of all of this. The Guggenheims are just immensely wealthy, even to this day. There are a lot of descendants around San Francisco, New York, a couple of Newport Beach, incidentally, but they're all under the radar, and they're not carrying the flag like their ancestors were, that's for sure. A little bit about Theodore von Karman. He came in 1930, Caltech, Hungarian Hebrew, brilliant, off the charts, born in 1881, and Chuck here knew him, Caltech. He died in 63, August of 63 at, 82 years old. And he came in 1930 and ran things up until 1949. And the other great thing about Theodore von Karman was that in 1942, while at Caltech, before the creation of JPL in 44, he was able to create Aerojet General out there in Azusa. In those days, they could do this with the blessing of Caltech. Today, you can't do that. Caltech is your partner, whether you like it or not. They share in all the royalties and the income, not the losses, just the income. And so the upshot was, again, von Karman had 5 partners. There were 6 of them total. They made a fortune with Aerojet General on the sale to General Tire Company of Ohio. It's not Toledo. It's not Toledo. It's the other one.
Akron.
What is it?
Akron.
Akron. You got it. Yeah. M.G. O'Neill bought it in the early 50s, and that was big payday for the 6th, the creation of Aerojet General. So they're all wealthy men and so on, comfortable. And what's interesting too about von Karman was that he came back to, of course, Caltech. He left in '49. He lived right here on the border of San Marino. Lives on Marengo. You know where Marengo and Los Robles, where Marengo tees off, goes up to Pasadena from Los Robles? 3rd house up, Spanish. That's where he lived. And he lived there with his mother and his sister. He never married. His sister died. She was the hostess for him. She died in '51. The mother died during World War II. And he died right after Jack Kennedy in April of '63 awarded Theodore von Karman in D.C. the highest scientific award that the United States hands out. And of course he died in August. That was it. And of course we know the rest about Kennedy in November, but without further elaboration. But what's interesting too is that Theodore von Karman is buried. He's encrypted over at Beth Olam, which is now part of Hollywood Forever Cemetery. His mother here in an alcove. He's there, his sister's there, his mother is there, Dad is back in Hungary. And they're in not good company, but bad company. Bugsy Siegel is next to him. 1947 to a violent end. How did that happen? Anyway, that's Theodore von Karman. Well, the story goes on with Harry Frank Guggenheim. He really, upon 1944, the formalizing of JPL, he was always had a hand in everything. He was married 3 times. His second wife was the heir to Morton Salt, and she was the one that convinced him that he should build, it's called the Cliff House, in the compound there at Sands Point, and the north side of Long Island, and the Long Island Sound. Beautiful place, I've been there. It's in Nassau County. And his father, Dan, and his mother built their place in 1917. It's called Hempstead House. And then on the compound in 23 is Harry's and his second wife's home. And then Castle Gould, Harold Gould's place, he was the son of Jay Gould. It's still there, but it was always unoccupied, and they used it for an outbuilding and stables and guests and that kind of thing. And Harold Gould could never live there. His wife hated the place, so he never moved in. He built it after his father died in 1892, Jay Gould, but never could convince his wife to move in. He held on to it for years, finally sold it to Daniel Guggenheim. So this compound is huge. It's got to be at least 100 acres. Choice land at Sands Point. Their neighbor was none other than Millicent Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's wife, who he never divorced. He was living in sin, as we all know, from 1917 until his death in August of 1951 in Beverly Hills. Marion Davies, another great story, but anyway, that for another time. Again, the upshot is that with Harry Guggenheim, particularly after World War II, there was acceptance of U.S. rocketry. And he saw to it that Dr. Robert Goddard died August 6th, 1945, the day they dropped the big one on Hiroshima. And he was 62 years old. He had all kinds of health problems his whole life. He had 200 patents. He wasn't a freak. He wasn't a kook. He was a genius. And what he did was, Harry Guggenheim saw to it that the museum was created there in Roswell, which is there to this day. The original office, workshop, statues, plaques, commemoratives, pictures, you name it, it is all there in Roswell today. We were over there a couple of years ago for this, and it's absolutely magnificent. And what's amazing to me is, if you've ever been to Roswell, which is southeastern New Mexico, on the way to Carlsbad Caverns, there's this life-size brass statue of Dr. Robert Goddard. No graffiti, hasn't been stolen for the value of the brass. It's amazing. And it's still there intact, so good for them. There's hope. And there's no security there either, which amazes me. I couldn't believe it when he first got there. Wow. Dr. Robert Goddard came out of Clark University in Worcester, Mass. It's pronounced Worcester, not Worcester. Worcester. For those New Englanders who are down east. But he never went back there. Well, he's buried back there. He died, as I say, in August of '45. He wanted to be buried with the rest of his family back there, and they're all there in Worcester, adjacent to the Clark University campus. So anyway, then he was on staff all the way from 1900 to 1945, and he didn't get back there very often, but he wrote a lot of papers and that kind of thing. Back to Harry Guggenheim, he completed all that to commemorate the memory of Harry Guggenheim. He then he divorced his second wife and then married a third one, Alicia Patterson, and that was in '39. And Alicia Patterson, she was the daughter of Joseph Medill Patterson, the great owner-operator of the New York Daily News, as well as the name, what was the big one? Not the Tribune in Chicago, but the other one. I forget the name. Sometimes. Yeah, that was it. He had that. And so she had a journalistic background. She was quite a few years younger, 15 years younger than Harry. She knew that Harry was nuts about aviation. That's all he could think about and talk about. And that was all right with her as long as she got her money and enabled her to realize her dream, which her dream was in 1939-40, upon their marriage, they purchased the Daily News in Garden City, Long Island, New York. It was just a backwater garage operation as a newspaper. And she got in there and worked like crazy and built that thing into what we know it is today. And there's a great story behind that, just briefly. She died of cancer at age 56 in 1963, much to the chagrin of Harry, because she was a helpmate to him in a lot of ways. And so he decided, well, he had to run this thing. So he stepped in at his advanced age, 75 years old, to run this thing. Well, he found out that's a lot of work, and it was contrary to his interest. he hired Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers ran. And he promised Bill Moyers, well, if you're a good boy and on my demise, why, you'll end up with this newspaper. Well, in 1971, all of a sudden, in 81, Harry's health broke. It was quick, very fast. And he did a quick turnaround and made a deal with Otis Chandler. Who else was there? There were four of them. Al Casey, he was the big money guy at the LA Times at that time. And they made the buy, much to the chagrin of Bill Moyers. And Bill Moyers to this day has a very bad taste in his mouth for the Guggenheims because it was promised to him and without any strings attached, but it didn't happen. So anyway, Harry died, left this huge fortune. Today it's about 80 million. Of course, 80 million today, when you read the Forbes billionaire chart, which just came out, it's not so much money. But as I say, they doled it out to a lot of Hebrew causes, educationally, health-wise, culturally, that kind of thing. And they support aviation too, I might add. That's the other great thing that Harry was really known for. Working on radar, night flying, safety features, all that. Those are all his points that he emphasized tremendously in those areas. And as a result, we enjoy all that, obviously, today in aviation. So anyway, that was that. Now, Harry had a cousin by the name of Peggy, who was a loose cannon. And Peggy created this, not fine arts, it's popular art, modern art, over in Venice. And she went through money like crazy, and she ended up spending all of the money. And so Harry stepped in to save her and brought the Peggy Guggenheim Museum into the fold of the Solomon R. Guggenheim in New York. So it's a branch today. So Peggy went to her great reward knowing that her collection was left intact. It's in Venice. She was famous for supporting Mother's Head, Max Ernst, Jackson Pollock. She supported a whole litany of those people on modern art, and so that's her legacy. And so the thing is well endowed today, thank God, because of Solomon Guggenheim, really, and Harry's efforts. So we have that. With that, I'll quit. I see the clock is turning and moving, and if there's any questions or comments, we'll be happy to entertain.
You know, we've been kind of sold a bill of goods that the V2 rocket was responsible for us moving into the rocket age. Goddard being forgotten, even though he shot off rockets right up here in this canyon.
Right, exactly.
Would you explain why that was? Because we, at Chaffee High, we had one of his rockets was shipped over here from Germany, and we fired the darn thing off once.
Yeah. It's, you know, I should preface this thing by saying that, you know, JPL is the engine that drives the economy of Pasadena. You and I, the taxpayer, $3 to $4 billion annually. And this has been going on for decades. Well, if that doesn't drive an economy locally, I don't know what will. And take the tour. It's coming up in May. For those who have yet to do that, it's a very good tour in May, and it'll be in the papers and so on. It's usually a Saturday and a Sunday together, and it's beautifully done and well orchestrated. But that's why we enjoy so many things. See, Caltech has the contract to run JPL jointly with NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So between them, that's how that all operates. In answer to your question, I don't know why Dr. Robert Goddard is left behind. You know, we were talking earlier, Chuck and I, when he got here earlier. In those days, in Theodore von Karman's era, it was the individual was the one. Today, it's a team effort. It just has to be because there's so much money. The complexities are so great. Without the government, we couldn't do it. And that's what's happened. That's where we are today. Incidentally, as a result of the Mars landing, the Aviation Week just awarded JPL the #1 prize, what, 2 weeks ago, something like that. Out of a lot of contestants, a lot of candidates for their work on the successful landing at Mars. So good for them. JPL continues to move on. And they have about, what, 4,500 employees up there at any given time. And as I say, there are a lot of smart people up there, and that's the engine that drives the economy. Thank God for JPL and Caltech. We could stay here all night and talk about Caltech. We'll do that another time. John?
Well, the other thing there is in dividing up the spoils after the war in Europe, we were fortunate in the United States that we got Werner von Braun. The Russians didn't. Werner was key with the Army in the development of rocketry, weaponizing rocketry, or building larger rockets, if you wish, beyond Goddard. And that was key in working with the Army. And the first successful satellite, the U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, was an Army project.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, I was brought up with some of this stuff. My dad did postgraduate research under von Karman and Timoshenko in the 30s at Caltech, and then worked on the JATO, development of the JATO rocket, and then finished his career as Director of Quality Assurance and Reliability at JPL.
Wow.
Well, this is my family's stuff. I didn't know that.
Doug?
Yeah, didn't they reward von Karman at the end of his career at Caltech by calling him a spy or something? And
That was Oppenheimer.
well, I think von Karman got
I don't recall that, no, that was Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer got nailed.
Oh, he sure did, on the Manhattan Project and all the ramifications. Sad
he
story.
became an artist in Paris later.
He did,
That's Frank Molina.
Yeah, Frank Molina, he became the artist in Paris, yeah.
Molina's the guy that,
Divorced himself completely from aerospace engineering, aeronautical engineering, just gave it all up. Sad story, with a brilliant mind.
On the subject of von Braun, was the Redstone rocket essentially like a copy of the V2, or were there modifications made to that? Do you know?
I'm sure there would have been modifications, but it would have been like 2 generations later, because there were others in between the V2, and I don't know where the Corporal came in. Whack Corporal was one of the first ones.
Yeah.
And I think that predates the Redstone.
So the Redstone used different technology than the V2?
It's the same technology.
Well, I
Direct
mean-
descendant.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's a good term.
Just as a collateral, I was lucky enough to work on the biographical dictionary in 2008 and 9 at the Huntington for the centennial event of January of 10, celebrating the second International Air Meet at Dominguez Hills in 1910. And we divided up into, so you can understand this, we divided it up. It was pretty easy, really. There were the pioneers in aviation, that was number 1. Number 2 was World War I efforts, obviously contributing to the success of the aircraft industry. Number 3 was the golden age, barnstorming, the 20s and the 30s. Number 4 was World War II, which really accelerated things, obviously. Number 5 was the jet age. And then number 6, final, was aerospace. And getting into that, you know, there was a clear understanding of all these various people who made these various contributions. In which category are we talking about? And then there's Kelly Johnson of Lockheed, who celebrated one of the greatest aeronautical engineers who ever lived. He went through about 3 or 4 of those, you knew him, 3 or 4 of those stages.
Back during Eisenhower's time, we were in trouble because Gagarin and them guys were spinning around and we didn't have nothing to go up. Well, can you get into that, or is that another subject for another?
Probably the JPL, and as the child, if you wish, of the Guggenheims, has to this day kept its focus on interplanetary exploration and not manned space. So that's a separation from this talk.
That's a separate deal.
is
All
Yuri
unmanned
Gagarin the first person to have, he's the first person to have survived coming back from space, but I don't think he's actually the first person to have been launched into space.
Yuri wasn't it?
No.
To my knowledge, and maybe there's, you know, maybe in Russia they know about others that we don't know
I
about.
don't think it was widely publicized by the Russians, that someone didn't survive.
I do remember 1957 with Sputnik 1 saving every issue of the Los Angeles Times from the launch for a year for 8th grade science and making that my science project. Beep, beep, beep.
Yes,
The supersonic wind tunnel that is now Art Center, and any connection there?
To Caltech, yes.
yeah. And there's a wind tunnel under the Guggenheim facility there, two
that was built in 29.
2 floors
The
down.
first wind tunnel on the west coast.
Yeah.
and it was later replaced in recent years with a new one.
New technology. Yeah.
And I think that was a cooperative effort with multiple aerospace companies for the supersonic aspect.
I don't know.
It predated supersonic.
I
When it
know
was
that
created, it was all subsonic.
Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States in 1956.
59.
And his entourage wanted to see the wind tunnel at Caltech, and they were denied.
He was denied to go to Disneyland too, I remember that. That was good. He didn't behave himself. Anyway, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Next month, April, fourth Monday, the 22nd, will be Tim Lindsay and his co-author talking about the Robinson's Gardens in Beverly Hills, one of the first estates in the community of Beverly Hills. And Robinson, J.W. Robinson family, the department store, and their family relations here in San Marino. In May, we have, whoops.
What do we have in May? We'll have a mystery guest.
No, it's the Jurasovich, and it's the observatories of Mount Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
And that's on the 20th of May, because the fourth Monday is Memorial Day. June will be the centennial celebration of the City of Hope and progress it's made in medical research and what it sees for the next century. So those are the three we have right now. Some of our programs come from our membership. Nick and I will be getting together next week to plan September, October, November to complete the Centennial Speaker Series. And if anybody here has an idea that you think we should consider, focus it towards San Marino if you can. But we had example, the Robinson's Gardens came from one of our members. The fellow that spoke to us about Pearl Harbor, that came from one of our members. So we get some good ideas. I appreciate everybody being here. For those of you, the book, we did not have the table open tonight to sell if you had not purchased the Centennial book for San Marino, but it is available at the library. You can purchase it anytime. If you need to pay for it with a credit card, most of the retail establishments in San Marino do carry it. We thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next month. Is there a 61 and 81?
Oh, here.